A needle in the right hand of God. The Norman Conquest of 1066 and the Making and Meaning of the Bayeux Tapestry. By R. Howard Bloch. Narrated by Stephen Hoye. Copyright 2006 by R. Howard Bloch. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with R. Howard Bloch and writers' representatives, and was produced in the year 2007 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Preface. I first saw the Bayeux Tapestry when I was 20. That was before 1983, when it was taken down from its perch around the interior walls of the palace of the bishops of Bayeux, cleaned, photographed, both rear and front, remounted upon a new backing, and placed in a three-sided angled glass case. Where viewers once stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the rectangular horseshoe of the tapestry, they now walk around the outside of the horseshoe as if it were an artifact, albeit a spectacular one, in a museum space. Explanatory panels, projections, audiophones, maps, and dioramas enrich the experience. Light, just bright and warm enough to bring out the tapestry's natural colors more fully than at any time in the past, has replaced the old low light associated with the husbanding of electricity in post-war France. All of which means that I caught a glimpse of the last vestige of how the tapestry might have looked, draped around the interior walls of the great hall of a castle, or suspended from the piers of the nave of a large church. This was a time when the tapestry, now considered first and foremost a work of art, may have had a social, political, and even propagandist function as an imposing record of the Norman Conquest of 1066, or, as the first historical mention of the tapestry in 1476 relates, a liturgical role in the yearly Feast of Relics in Notre Dame of Bayeux. The trip to Bayeux was my mother's idea. She grew up in North Carolina, where her formal training as a textile engineer was rounded by the tradition of Southern crafts, embroidery, needlework, quilt-making, comparable to the arts of the needle of medieval England and Normandy, still known for their embroidery and lace. When we moved north, my mother transformed her native talents into what in the 1950s was called creative stitchery. Abstract collages, assembled from all kinds of materials, from swatches of fabric and thread to ribbon and feathers, laid upon a background of cloth, decorated our walls like the domestic silks, plain tabbies, or embroidered linens found in some homes of the Middle Ages. My mother and I stayed in Bayeux's Hôtel Lion d'Or. I would later learn that this is where, in the summer of 1941, a team of art historians, archaeologists, and artists sent by Hitler to study the tapestry were lodged and fed. After the war, de Gaulle met Churchill at the Lion d'Or, and they shared omelettes smothered in legendary Norman butter. So you might say that my first love of the tapestry came about as a whirlwind of circumstances, maternal guidance, the possibility of touching a bit of medieval history, along with the living history of World War II into which I was born, and which by then was already an intellectual interest, the incredible beauty and power of the tapestry itself, and eggs. Since then I have wanted to know more about who designed it, who embroidered it, and where, when, and in keeping with my mother's preoccupations, how it was actually made. The story of the sewing of the tapestry would have delighted my father, who was an expert in the manufacture of finished cloth. Were he still alive, I would have so enjoyed speaking with him about how his 11th-century equivalent might have gone about finding or commissioning a suitable piece of linen, discussing thread counts and selvage, assessing the dye lots and techs or weight of wool yarn. I can still remember the way he would look closely and rub a piece of worsted between thumb and middle finger, put a match to a fibre or two, hold it to his nostrils, and know the exact composition and weave of the little swatch of cloth, whose ragged edges had been cut by pinking shears. On my last visit to Bayeux, I made an appointment with the tapestry's current curator, Sylvette Lemanienne, whose official title is Conservateur de la Médiathèque Municipale et de la Tapisserie de Bayeux. She told me that I would be her first appointment of the morning, and when I arrived at 10 a.m. I was shown promptly into the outer office, a high-ceilinged room with long French windows. 5 or 6 women sat at their desks, speaking on the telephone or typing in front of computer screens, while another waited in front of a copier, and still another fed a fax. A printer hummed alongside the bleeps of the answering machine as it delivered the morning's recorded messages. It was a workshop of sorts, what the medievals called a ladies' chamber, which designated the place where sewing took place. Who knows if these present-day keepers of the tapestry of Bayeux were not the descendants of the women who had embroidered it over 9 centuries ago? The curator, who was herself completing a doctoral thesis on the tapestry, informed me right away that there were no unedited documents in the center's archives. I realized that I was probably not the first pesky scholar to enter her office with the hope of uncovering some of its hidden secrets. We chatted amiably about current scholarship and the state of the question of the tapestry's origins. Was it made right after the Norman Conquest, or a little later? Was the idea that of William the Conqueror's wife, Matilda, or his half-brother Odo? Did it all take place in England or in France? At one point I asked Madame Lemanienne why the French persisted in calling the tapestry a tapestry when it was, in fact, an embroidery. A rolling of the eyes and a pouty exhalation were the signs of what I could only imagine to have been something along the lines of, "You Americans are sometimes so naive." "The mayor of Bayeux would never permit it," she replied. "The mayor?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "He is afraid that if you could change the name of the Bayeux tapestry to the Bayeux embroidery, the name Bayeux might also some day be changed, and that would mean a loss of tourism for the town." She reminded me that the tapestry had not always been called thus, and that before it was the Bayeux tapestry, it was Queen Matilda's tapestry, and before that, King William's cloth. Her response surprised me, since I could not have imagined that a matter as lofty as the name of a famous work of art came down to a question of tourism and money. But of course. The tapestry still participates in the medieval tradition by which churches and monasteries guarded the relics of saints and other treasures in order to attract pilgrims along the paths that are the equivalent of today's great tourist routes, Saint-Jacques of Compostela in the south, and to the west, Mont-Saint-Michel, which is actually pictured in the tapestry in its 11th century state. From that moment I began to think of the tapestry not only as a great work of art, but as a physical object with a long past, including how it disappeared for so many centuries, how it was used to cover a wagon full of munitions during the French Revolution, how it has been pressed into the service of various local interests and national causes since its rediscovery in the 1720s. As I left the administrative offices of the Centre Guillaume le Conquérant, I was swept along by a sea of English school-children who had crossed the Channel earlier that morning. They were streaming out of several long buses in the parking lot, and as soon as they passed the ticket window they surrounded the tapestry so fully that I could hardly see it. Each time I managed to push nearer the glass, which was really too close to see a wide enough swath of the tapestry to understand the brilliance of its visual flow, I found myself forced again to the rear of a sea of bobbing adolescent heads. One of the things that I have learned about the tapestry in the course of study is that it was meant to be looked at in large sweeps that enfold the viewer in what sometimes seems like a three-dimensional space. I made it around the horseshoe, more or less, and headed from the display room to the bookshop, where I had once purchased a long, unfolding reproduction of the tapestry that has given me much pleasure over the years. This was the best access one could have to it from afar, until the appearance in 2003 of the digital edition of the tapestry on CD, better than the reproduction in books, whose pages, no matter how fast one turns them, never capture the propelling forward movement of the tapestry's ship launchings, channel crossings, or cavalry charge. I found one of the books Madame Lemanienne had recommended. I walked up Bayeux's Rue Saint-Jean and stepped into the courtyard of the Lion d'Or. Sitting in front of an omelette that bubbled and bulged as it arrived hot from the kitchen, I remembered that first time and began there and then to imagine this little excursion into the medieval past, so important in the making of a world that is still recognizably our own. Chapter 1. Lances, Axes, and Needles. Bad news reached Duke William of Normandy on the evening of October 13th, 1066. In the 2 weeks since his spectacular crossing of the Channel in 1,000 boats, he had pillaged freely in the English countryside between the old Roman ports of Pevensey and Hastings. Now word came that King Harold had defeated Scandinavian invaders near the town of York and was advancing rapidly from the north. By nightfall, Anglo-Saxons appeared along Senlac Ridge, the high ground above the Norman camp. Harold held a strategic advantage over William, who was on unfamiliar terrain. He would be even stronger if reinforcements arrived from London. William ordered his troops on high alert. Many did not sleep at all that night. Others awoke with the first light, which appeared at 5:20 on the morning of October 14th. Sunrise at 6:28 brought an ominous sign. As William dressed for battle, surrounded by his most trusted advisers, his half-brothers, Bishop Odo of Bayeux and Count Robert of Mortain, and a company of great Norman and Breton lords, his squires put on his corselet the wrong way around. It was a small thing, but William had confessed his sins the night before, and made communion at the first hour. In a world that believed in dialogue between the human and the divine, it seemed a sign from God. As his attendants struggled to turn the padding beneath his finely woven chain-mail and breast armor, William made light of the situation. "We shall turn the strength of my duchy," he joked, "into a kingdom." He lifted the little sack of relics from Odo's extended hand and placed them around his neck, and before Odo had finished praying for victory, William ordered the battle ranks. The Duke was steady in the face of unpredictable events. In the crossing of the Channel on the night of September 27th, William's ship had arrived before the rest of the fleet. An oarsman reported that as far as he could see there was nothing but sea and sky. The Norman leader, certain that all the others would arrive before long, sat down to an abundant meal, accompanied by spiced wine, as if we were in his hall at home. The French from France would be on the left, the Bretons on the right, William and the Normans in the center. The archers on foot would open the battle. Set crossbowmen would pierce the faces of the English with their speeding shafts. The knights on horse would be to the rear of the foot. William pronounced what he knew might be his final words. "Raise your standards, men, and let there be no measure or moderation to your righteous anger. Let the lightning of your glory be seen from the east to the west. Let the thunder of your charge be heard, and may you be the avengers of most noble blood." Great shouting could be heard, the clinking of lifted helmets and mail, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the harsh bray of trumpets on both sides. Dragons could be seen everywhere, on shields and on the banners that caught the wind, as William's army began to array itself as he had ordered. The horsemen and infantry followed the banners to join their battalion. The archers observed them to know by the angle of their flutter how high and in what direction to shoot. The English could not be far off. Through the dust rising from the Norman camp, the forest glittered, full of spears. Suddenly one of William's men rode out before the rest. He was not a knight, but a poet by the name of Taillefer, one of the jongleurs the Duke had brought with him to entertain the troops. He tossed his sword in the air and began to twirl it in front of the enemy line. Heedless of death, he pricked his horse, which began to charge. He lowered his lance, which pierced an Anglo-Saxon shield, knocking the axe-bearer lifeless to the ground. The jongleur severed the head from the prostrate body, and, holding it in the air for the Normans to see, began to sing. The Norman army, in the words of a later chronicler, struck up the Song of Roland to fire them into battle, with the example of a heroic warrior. As Taillefer fell, the missiles of war began to fly overhead. Arrows, javelins, axes, stones tied to sticks, the square bolts from the crossbows that no shield could resist. The fighting did not at first go as William planned. The suddenness of the attack left no time for those on foot to place themselves in advance of the mounted knights. Norman archers could not soften Harold's axe-bearing housecarls, the king's personal guard. The knights with lances couched under their arms failed to penetrate the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. In the chaos of the first clash, the rumor circulated that William had been killed. His men broke rank. William quickly decided that he must turn the situation as he had turned his corselet earlier that morning. Drawing upon a tactic that had worked in the past, and was well known to the knights who had travelled all the way from southern Italy for the campaign against Harold, the Norman chief joined his fleeing troops until he seemed to be leading the rout. Then, wheeling in his tracks, William raised his visor and showed his face. "Look at me," he cried. "I am alive, and with the aid of God I will conquer. What madness is persuading you to flee? What way is open to escape? The sea lies behind. You will fight to conquer if you want only to live." Odo, armed with a club to respect the Christian prohibition against ecclesiastics shedding blood, rallied the young men. The Anglo-Saxons rejoiced to see the Normans flee, and as William had gambled that he would, Harold charged. The Normans drew the enemy from the high ground. Fanning out and doubling back, they caught the Anglo-Saxon army in a pincer maneuver like that by which Allied forces would trap the German Seventh Army in the Falaise pocket in August 1944. And the fighting, as in the Battle of Normandy of World War II, was close and fierce. The dead, by falling, seemed to move more than the living, recalled one eyewitness. It was not possible for the lightly wounded to escape, for they were crushed to death by the serried ranks of their companions. William lost 3 mounts, killed from under him as he fought on horseback and hand-to-hand among his troops. With his angry blade he tirelessly pierced shields, helmets, and hauberks, writes William's chaplain and biographer William of Poitiers. Utterly disdaining fear and dishonour, the Duke charged his enemies and laid them low. The sun set at 5:04 on October 14, 1066, and at the end of the day 6,000 human corpses, half of those who had ridden, sailed, or walked to Hastings, littered the field alongside 600 horses. The mangled bodies that had been the flower of the English nobility and youth covered the ground as far as the eye could see, laments the 12th century historian Orderic Vitalis. Harold was dead, so mutilated that his wife was brought to identify his body by certain marks. Anglo-Saxons who survived their leader made a last stand along a trench known in the 11th century as the Malfosse, bad ditch, into which many Normans, not knowing the terrain, fell and perished without realizing they had won the day. Many left their corpses in deep woods. Many who had collapsed on the roots blocked the way for those who came after. Even the hooves of the horses inflicted punishment on the dead. As the last of Harold's followers vanished into the night, William's army, exhausted, made camp among the fallen of both sides, over which he now ruled as king. Having awakened that morning still burdened by the title by which he had always been known, the Bastard, Duke William went to sleep that night having earned the name history would accord him, the Conqueror. The meeting of Normans and Anglo-Saxons at Hastings was the most decisive battle of the Middle Ages, and one of the determining days in the making of the West. Hastings changed Britain, which had been dominated since the end of Roman rule by invading tribes from the continent and the north, Angles, Saxons, and Vikings. This day, more than any other, turned Britain away from its Scandinavian past and toward Europe. Hastings inaugurated the era of the knight, the social dominance of those who fought with lance on horseback. With the watershed of 1066 came the beginning of the end of the chaos and darkness, the political disintegration and the lack of learning between the collapse of Charlemagne's empire after his death in the early 9th century and the flowering of state institutions and culture of the Anglo-Norman world. How fitting that the Norman army should enter battle singing of the heroic deeds of Charlemagne's nephew Roland, as if William would begin where the Emperor of the Franks had left off. William had himself crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066, just as Charlemagne had been crowned in Rome on Christmas Day 800. If the Battle of Hastings began with poetry, it ended in the realm of the visual arts. The Norman Conquest of England produced the world's most famous textile, the Bayeux Tapestry, a 230-foot-long by 20-inch-high running embroidered account of the events leading to Hastings and of the battle itself. Made in the decades following the conquest by those who were party to it, the tapestry, which contains both images and Latin inscriptions, is a principal source of knowledge about the day that shaped England out of the remains of Anglo-Saxon culture and the Normans, who were themselves relatively recent settlers along the northwest coast of France and the bed of the Seine. William, only the 6th generation of the Dukes of Normandy, was the descendant of another bold adventurer, the Viking King Rollo, who in 911 struck a peace treaty with the French King Charles the Simple, by which the old Carolingian territory of Neustria, now weak and ripe for raiding, would be his. The tapestry is unique. Pieces of cloth from the ancient world give some indication of what appealed to the eyes of ancient Persians, Egyptians, and Greeks. Pile carpets from southern Siberia and Turkey, silks from Constantinople, Syria, and China are dazzling reminders of the riches of the Middle and Far East. Weavings from the bogs of Switzerland, Scandinavia, and East Anglia reveal much about the making of worsteds and tabby, beginning with the Celts. Church garments, such as the gold and silk-embroidered handiwork of Saints Erlindis and Relindis, who founded the Abbey of Aldenic in the 8th century, the stole and girdle that once belonged to the 10th century St. Cuthbert, and a silk twill coronation robe made for King Roger of Sicily in the 1130s, are miraculous survivors of the medieval textile arts. None, however, is on the scale of the Bayeux Tapestry. None possesses its sustained aesthetic quality. None tells a story in images and words. None, in short, captures the essence of an age as vividly as the Bayeux Tapestry, which is for the High Middle Ages what the friezes of Nineveh are for ancient Assyria, the Elgin marbles are for Greece of the city-state, or the Lady with Unicorn tapestry is for Renaissance Europe. The only piece of cloth comparable in celebrity to the Bayeux Tapestry is the Shroud of Turin, whose authenticity has been thrown into doubt by radiocarbon dating that suggests it is not the image of a Jewish man crucified in the 1st century, but a 14th century fabrication. The tapestry opens a precious window upon feudalism and weaponry and tactics, nautical technique, shipbuilding, and the maritime culture of the North Sea and the English Channel. Its embroidered tableaux reveal much about relations among secular government, ecclesiastical hierarchy, and the papacy, local baronial, castle, and church architecture, rituals of death, burial, and coronation, hunting and agriculture, customs of eating, cooking, and dress, the material world of sacred and sumptuous objects, and the means of communication and transportation in England, Normandy, and Brittany at the dawn of what Charles Homer Haskins calls the Renaissance of the Middle Ages. The story that the tapestry tells takes place over a period of 2 years leading up to the conquest. At its left, or beginning edge, we see the ailing King Edward the Confessor, ruled 1042 to 1066, in council with Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the man who would be king. The interior space may be the royal seat at Winchester, since Westminster Abbey, later shown in the tapestry, had not yet been consecrated. We know that Edward is frail because of his bodily posture, drooping shoulders and eyes, and because he has never been well. The Confessor, son of Emma of Normandy and her first husband, King Ethelred II, ruled 978 to 1016, the Unready, was a pious man, and things might have gone differently for England if some of the energy he spent praying had been reserved for reproduction. Edward, married to Harold's sister Edith, was childless, and his bearing at the beginning of the Bayeux Tapestry bespeaks the looming crisis for Anglo-Saxon England. We shall never know the exact nature of Edward's initial exchange with Harold, yet it is hard not to infer that something must have been said about royal succession. Leaving the audience with Edward, Harold rides to the Godwin ancestral lands in Bosham, where he feasts in the company of retainers. As the feast ends, the tapestry shows the Earl and his men boarding ships for what remains a mysterious trip to the continent. Was the purpose of Harold's crossing of the Channel to discuss succession with Duke William of Normandy? A medieval biography of Edward speaks of Harold's travelling abroad in order to study the French princes. Did Harold visit Normandy to arrange a marriage? His younger brother Tostig had married the sister of Baldwin V of Flanders, father of Duke William's wife, Matilda, and the 12th-century historian Orderic Vitalis maintains that Harold, who had married not in church but only more Danico, in the Danish custom, by cohabitation, sought the hand of one of William and Matilda's daughters. Orderic's contemporary Eadmir of Canterbury states that Harold sought the release of members of his own family, his brother Wulfnoth and his nephew Hakon, Anglo-Saxon hostages sent to the Norman court at the time of Harold's father's own troubles with King Edward. Still others suggest that Harold did not intend to visit Normandy at all, but was en route to Hungary to bring back the most legitimate candidate for kingship, the Etheling Edgar, great-grandson of Ethelred II. The historian William of Malmesbury argues implausibly that Harold was on a fishing expedition when his ship was blown off course by a bad wind. Harold was known as a great hunter, and the tapestry portrays him repeatedly with a falcon on his arm, but fishing was not a noble pursuit in 11th-century England. Whatever the reason for Harold's travels, sometime in the fall of 1064 he made landfall near the frontier of Upper Normandy. He is shown barefoot and wielding a dagger, indications of shipwreck. The tapestry thus dramatizes Harold's capture by William's vassal, Guy of Ponthieu, who transfers the valuable prisoner to the Duke's custody at his court in Rouen. From Rouen, William and Harold set out on a military expedition to Brittany. While crossing the river Couesnon, Mont-Saint-Michel in the background, Harold is shown bravely rescuing a knight who has slipped into the treacherous mud of the riverbed. William and Harold capture the strongholds of Dol, Rennes, and Dinan, and as the Duke and the Earl return to Normandy via Bayeux, William bestows arms on Harold, who swears a sacred oath on relics. Not just on relics, but on 2 reliquaries. The tapestry captures him, arms outstretched, touching with both hands the jeweled cases that bind him in God's presence to his word. In the epic scenario leading to Hastings, the embroidered image of Harold's swearing is the equivalent of a photograph of what would become his misdeed. The crux of the tapestry drama turns around the nature of Harold's oath. Did Harold merely become William's vassal, as the gift of arms and oath of fealty would indicate? Did he make promises regarding the release of hostage family members? Did Harold swear to respect William's rights of succession to the English throne? Was there some kind of understanding involving joint rulership? Was Harold's oath taken willingly or under duress? Was he tricked, as Anglo-Saxon sources suggest? Part of the tapestry's lasting appeal stems from the fact that alongside the numerous partisan historical accounts by medieval chroniclers on both sides of the Channel, it is not a one-sided version of the events of 1066. In the mold of all enduring works of art, the tapestry's images, and even its words, make for the richest range of possible meanings. Having sworn an ill-fated oath, regardless of its actual content, Harold returns to England, where he again meets with King Edward, who looks even more beleaguered than he did at first. As we know from the historical record, Edward died on January 6, 1066, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, England's first Norman Romanesque church, which had been consecrated only 2 weeks earlier. The tapestry signals the newness of construction via a figure placing a weathercock on the roof as Edward's bier is carried to its final resting place. The tapestry's second act begins with Harold's seizure of the crown the day after Edward's death, and the appearance of Halley's Comet, which was visible in the skies all over Europe in April 1066, at the tapestry's upper edge. Harold is depicted with the traditional emblems of imperial power, a scepter and an orb topped with a cross, in the frontal pose of majesty familiar to Roman and Byzantine emperors, as well as to Charlemagne and the Ottonians of the 10th century, who saw themselves as the heirs of Rome. The news of usurpation spreads quickly to Normandy, where William, in council with Odo, orders a fleet to be built in preparation for invasion. The tapestry discloses in detail the felling of trees for lumber, the shaving and shaping of boats, and the loading of ships with food and wine, arms and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?